The Nazi angel of death, Josef Mengele, is in hiding. Half the world wants to see him hanged, though the very thought of him swinging on the end of the rope makes him chew on the edges of his mustache. Still, despite what people have said about his horrific experiments, he takes out a pen and writes, "Weaker humans should not be permitted to reproduce. This is the only way for humankind to exist and sustain itself." At that moment, he stops writing for a second and remembers the agonizing howls of the kids he experimented on. It was all for a good cause, he thinks, and carries on writing. Make no mistake, this man committed some of the most heinous war crimes in history, so it's surprising then that he managed to evade for so long the hands of many Nazi hunters that wanted him to face the music, i.e. a rope with a noose at the end. We'll come to his unbelievable escape soon, but for those of you not acquainted with this arguably most infamous Nazi doctor, let's first have a look at some of the things he did and what kind of background shaped him into the monster we know and hate. Born on March 6, 1911, in Günzburg, Bavaria, Germany, he grew up in a fairly affluent surroundings. His father owned a farming equipment company called Karl Mengele and Sons, and so Joseph and his younger two brothers, Karl and Aloy, had all the things children could ask for. The New York Times once asked what made this embodiment of absolute evil a notorious Nazi who was the very symbol of pure evil. But as the writer and Holocaust survivor Hannah Arendt wrote after the war, we should never underestimate the banality of evil. Evil wears a shirt and a tie and kisses its wife and kids on the cheek before leaving for work in the morning. The young Josef Mengele was just an ordinary kid, not some little psycho who went around setting cats on fire for fun. Had things in Germany been just a little bit different when he was turning into a man, he might have gone on to live a successful, normal kind of life, employing the medical skills he learned at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in a positive way. But as things turned out in the end, a man named Adolf Hitler failed at being an artist and succeeded in moving a large part of the German population into believing that their woes after the First World War were mostly caused by the Jews. Mengele became useful to Hitler, not just for his medical training, but for the fact that he earned a PhD in physical anthropology, a discipline described as a branch of anthropology concerned with the origin, evolution, and diversity of people. Diversity, not Adolf Hitler's strong suit. We're sure you've heard about what the Nazis thought was a superior race and an inferior race. As you all know, the Nazis exterminated millions of people that they believed were inferior kinds of people, not just Jewish folks either. In 1931, when Mengele was just 20, he became a member of an ultra-right-wing organization. This was just after the 1929 Wall Street crash in the USA, which affected Germany more than any other nation. Not being able to pay back its loans to the US, Germans were thrust into an economic crisis that had a large number of the population down on its hands and knees. When that kind of thing happens in society, people often turn to political extremes. They look for a leader who will take them out of their misery, and that man was the charismatic killer Adolf Hitler. By January 1933, Hitler was made chancellor by President Hindenburg. He then went about trying to get rid of that thing called democracy, giving himself powers that no one could touch, sometimes eliminating his foes during the process. Then, when Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler gained total power in Germany as the Führer. As this was happening, Mengele was one of those people cheering Hitler on. He enlisted in the Stormtroopers in 1933, aka the Brown Shirts. Soon, Mengele became a fully fledged member of the Nazi Party, and after that, a member of the SS. In case you're wondering, the Stormtroopers, or the SA, were a paramilitary force that had been in existence for years. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, started as bodyguards for Hitler, and then after something called the Night of the Long Knives happened, in which Hitler had SA leaders executed in fear of a coup, the SS became the leading paramilitary force under Hitler's right-hand man, Heinrich Himmler. It's said when Mengele joined this group, he'd already rubbed shoulders with some of those highest-ranking Nazi leaders. He was already in a good position to impress the Führer when he joined the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in 1937, an ominous name for an organization if there ever was one. Mengele joined the medical service in the Waffen-SS after the Second World War started and later became the second lieutenant in a medical reserve battalion. Then, when working at the SS Race and Settlement main office, he worked on selecting suitable candidates for Germanization. That meant choosing the people they thought could be assimilated into the German culture. In 1942, while working as a medical officer on the Eastern Front with the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, Mengele rescued 2 soldiers from a German tank and so was awarded the Iron Cross First Class and also the Medal for Care of the German People. He could add a wound badge to those medals, meaning he was injured during the ordeal. His commendation read that he acquitted himself brilliantly in the face of the enemy. He was wounded another time and so moved on to the SS Race and Settlement main office back in Berlin and became a captain at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. You can see where his life was going, what kind of ideals he had. This was a man with a vision, or so his friends later said. It was an ugly vision, one which saw the Nordic race ruling over other races, one which according to a former colleague of his included the annihilation of the Jews as a provision for the recovery of the world and Germany. Through his studies, he came to believe in a superior race, however mad that might sound to us now. Prior to ending up at Auschwitz and doing the terrible things we'll soon talk about, he wrote 3 books that encapsulated his vision. These books talked about hereditary traits and how genetics shape the people we are. So, when he got to Auschwitz, he wasn't only a doctor with the kind of academic background that would make Hitler's ears stand to attention, but unlike all those other medical folks, he had been involved in serious combat and had a list of medals to prove it. He was destined for big things among the Nazis, and he was at the top of his game. It didn't go unnoticed. His friend later said that when Mengele arrived at the camp, he had a special aura about him. He'd actually asked to be stationed at the death camp because he knew that was the place where he'd be able to conduct his completely unethical experiments. When people arrived at Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi concentration camps, they were either selected for work duties or, if deemed not fit for work, sent to the gas chamber. It's thought 1.1 million people died in this camp alone, men, women, and children, each being sent to one of the camps in a complex of Auschwitz camps where various horrific things took place. Auschwitz I, for instance, was the first camp where at first mostly Polish and Soviet prisoners were being beaten and tortured and gassed. When Auschwitz II was completed, freight trains took the Jews in very large numbers to be killed in the gas chambers. It's thought that around 960,000 Jews arrived, of which 865,000 were gassed soon after. But others that died in Auschwitz camps included 74,000 ethnic Poles, 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet POWs, and something close to 15,000 other Europeans. If they weren't sent to a gas chamber, many died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, or summary execution. As you'll soon see, some were taken out back and shot in the head. Many of those that were left faced being part of medical experiments, the focus of our show today. Just to give you an idea of how someone might have been chosen for death or labor or experimentation, here is what one survivor said happened to her after she arrived at the camp. Dr. Mengele pulled me out of a queue as we were on the way from the Sea Lager camp to the gas chamber. I was the only one picked that day personally by Mengele and his assistant. They took me to his laboratory where I met other children. They were screaming from pain. I was injected with drugs and chemicals. My body most of the time was connected to tubes which inserted some drugs into my body. You might wonder, why were they doing this? The answer is it all was in line with the Nazi ideology combined with the war effort. German soldiers were injured on the battlefield and sometimes ad hoc surgery needed to happen to save their lives. What better way to practice this surgery than on prisoners in camps? What if the German soldiers parachuted into freezing waters? How would you warm them up? That's why medical doctors conducted horrific freezing experiments. What if a German soldier was wounded and the cut got infected? Sometimes the Nazis purposefully created an open wound on a person, often women called rabbits, and rubbed various things in such as dirt or broken glass into the wound. They then administered certain drugs that they were working on, often on behalf of the German pharmaceutical companies. In one such experiment, not involving Mengele, a report stated that 13 people died from gangrene, while 6 others were taken out and shot so they couldn't ever tell anyone about what happened to them. It was later written the surviving victims were permanently disabled both physically and psychologically. Some of them eventually testified against the Nazi doctors after the war was over, with the court seeing the photographs of their scars. What's shocking is that recent reports have stated that not many Americans know this kind of thing actually happened. A paper in the National Institutes of Health said in 2018, 41% of Americans and 66% of millennials do not know the historical significance of Auschwitz. You'll know a lot more after you've finished watching the show, lest we forget, dear viewers. We'll never know the exact number of people who were part of these experiments, but one study estimated that it was 27,759. It said that 4,364 people died either because of the experiments or were killed right after, due to the fact that the Nazis wanted to keep them quiet. Bear in mind, even though the war itself was a monstrous thing, the Nazis didn't want their enemies or even the greater German populace knowing what went on behind closed doors. Just to give you an example of what did go on behind closed doors when victims were executed after the experiments, this is some testimony from a Czech doctor who worked with the Germans. High amputations were performed. For example, even whole arms with shoulder blades or legs with iliaca were amputated. These operations were performed mostly on insane women who were immediately killed after the operation by a quick injection of Evipan. All specimens gained in operations were carefully wrapped up in sterile gauze and immediately transported to the SS hospital nearby, where they were to be used in the attempt to heal the injured limbs of wounded German soldiers. So, these experiments involved many doctors and many camps, but let's not lose ourselves here and get back to Dr. Mengele, who we should say may have come out of the war as medical enemy number 1. He was also one cog among many others in a giant machine. Remember that Mengele's big interest was hereditary traits. He also had a particular interest in identical twins, given that they share the same DNA. He was often responsible for picking people out who arrived from the trains, allocating them a quick death or for one of his experiments. He was delighted whenever he found twins, especially young ones, who it said often took a liking to this uncle-type character. When he happily whistled during the selection process, perhaps one of the most disturbing things you can think of, he'd sometimes pull kids out and later hand them candies. He also made sure they were fed well, but not because he was a great guy, he wanted his specimens to survive. As one of the inmate doctors later remarked about him, he was capable of being so kind to the children, to have them become fond of him, to bring them sugar, and to think of small details in their daily lives, and to do things we would genuinely admire. And then next to that, the crematorium smoke, and these children, tomorrow or in a half hour, he's going to send them there. Well, that's where the anomaly lay. But many went straight to the gas chamber. At Birkenau camp and Auschwitz subcamp, Mengele was later described by another doctor as being far and away the chief provider for the gas chamber and the crematory ovens. Mengele might just have been one of the few doctors on rotation who waited for the cattle cars full of people to arrive at the camp. But reports now say, unlike some others, he actually enjoyed the selection process. Not all soldiers, it seemed, like sending people to their deaths, but Mengele was often full of vim when it was his turn. This was expressed by some of the survivors, who said when the dashingly handsome, neatly dressed Mengele looked them in the eye, he conveyed the impression of a gentle and cultured man and spoke with a cheerful expression on his face, almost like he had fun. He was very playful. He then walked up and down the line, pointing at each person, in turn shouting left, left, right, left, left, right. Left meant to the chamber, right meant to labor or medical experimentation. And man, did he ever have a bad temper, despite the whistling. There was one time he told a guard to separate a child he wanted from her mother. The mother fought back, scratching the guard. Mengele, now furious, calmly walked up to them and shot them both dead. The rest of the train's occupants screamed out, to which Mengele turned his back and said all of them left. Then there were the hospitals, where Nazis actually treated prisoners, but only so they could do more labor. If they were too sick, they were sent to the gas chamber. One doctor later testified that Mengele would often turn up at the hospital looking for suitable candidates for his experiments. He said Dr. Mengele's men would march before him with their arms in the air while he continued to whistle his Wagner, or it might be Verdi or Johann Strauss. Things could happen quickly. In 1943, there was an outbreak of something called Noma, which is a gangrenous bacterial disease that affects the mouth and face. This happened at the Romani camp, and Mengele took a lot of interest. He had several afflicted children killed and their heads sent to the SS Medical Academy in Graz for research purposes. The disease was caused no doubt by the conditions of the camp, but of course Mengele thought it was down to genetic factors relating to the Roma. In other cases, there were outbreaks of typhus and scarlet fever. In one such case, Mengele sent 600 women to the gas chamber and then ordered a full cleanup of the camp. After that, he said something along the lines of, "Do I have to do everything around here?" But most of his work was around genetics. He loved it when people with dwarfism arrived at the camp because he wanted to understand why they were the way they were. As we said, he also liked it when twins arrived. And when he found some twins with blonde hair and brown eyes, he would sometimes inject their eyes with methylene blue just to see if he could make them look more Aryan. One doctor later remarked, "In June 1943, I went to the gypsy camp in Birkenau. I saw a wooden table. On it were samples of eyes. They each had a number and a letter. The eyes were very pale yellow to bright blue, green, and violet." Twins have always been important when it comes to understanding genetic traits, and Mengele was well aware that for the first time in human history, many twins were in the same place and all of them could be used for research. What if, he pondered, through his study of twins, he could improve what he considered the genetic superiority of the Aryans? He was also very interested in how twins reacted individually to specific experiments. What if you poisoned one and not the other, and then opened them up? Would they look the same? Stuff like that. When they arrived at the camp, he immediately gave orders that they should not be executed under any circumstances, or not until he was done with them at least. They were to be well fed and housed in comfortable quarters compared to the rest of the prisoners. When they arrived, sad and confused, he leaned down and said to them, "You should call me Uncle Mengele." Sometimes they called him Uncle Pepe. The seemingly nice man that gave them treats and offered them rides in his car, sometimes unbeknownst to them, to the gas chamber. Survivors later testified that he treated them well. One of them said that as a twin she felt completely elevated, segregated from the hurly-burly of the camp. Still, others remarked that they witnessed flames really coming up every day, every night, where the bodies were burned. They heard every evening a cacophony of screams, which was followed by an unbearable smell. but they were just too young to really understand the horrors that were happening around them. Another of the survivors said years later, whenever he spoke to me, he was very polite, giving the impression that he was interested in me. It was hard to believe that this little smile and courteous behavior were just a facade behind which he devised the most horrific murderous schemes. Of the 1,500 pairs of twins that he had for his experiments, only around 200 pairs survived. That's because sometimes he'd perform needless amputations and later have them killed. Other times their hearts were injected with phenol so they could subsequently be dissected. He'd inject one twin with a disease and not the other, and then see what happened when he conducted a blood transfusion between them. They usually died. Survivor Jonah Locke said, Mengele removed organs from people without anesthetic, and if one twin died, the other would be murdered. The reason for that was the doctor wanted to know not only how they compared in life, but what happened to each of their bodies after they died. On one night alone, he killed 14 pairs of twins by injecting their hearts with chloroform. The Hungarian pathologist and camp POW named Miklos Nisli explained what happened after. I would bathe the corpses in calcium chloride and cook them in large pots so that their skeletons could be preserved in the Museum of the Third Reich. Another time, Mengele was looking at two young male twins with joint pains. He told the radiologist it was caused by tuberculosis, to which the radiologist argued back that he'd seen no sign of the disease. Mengele then left the room and went to see the boys. When he came back a few minutes later, he said to the radiologist, "You're right, there was nothing." The radiologist looked confused, and after a pause, Mengele told him, "Yes, I dissected them." He later explained such actions to a friend, saying, "It would be a sin, a crime, and irresponsible not to utilize the possibilities that Auschwitz had for twin research." In perhaps the most horrific experiment, he tried to sew a pair of twins together. According to Eva Moses Kor, a twin herself at the camp, a pair of gypsy twins had their blood vessels and organs connected. In her own words, she said, Mengele had attempted to create Siamese twins by connecting the blood vessels and organs. The twins screamed day and night until gangrene set in, and after 3 days, they died. On June 8, 1961, at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who we'll soon get to, a survivor named Vera Alexander testified. This is how some of that dialogue went. Presiding judge, what did you witness? Witness Alexander. There was a set of twins, gypsies, whom he took away one day from the block where I was. That was Ziga Unerlager, the gypsy camp. Some days later, he returned with them, with veins in their arms and their backs sewn together. Presiding judge, I did not understand that. Attorney General, he sewed them. Presiding judge, sewed the veins together? Witness Alexander, yes. Presiding judge, did he turn them into Siamese twins? Witness Alexander, he sewed their arms together. They were already full of pus and full of wounds. Some media, including the New York Times, have aired doubts over whether the twin experiments happened, but Alexander, who cared for 50 sets of twins at the camp, said it did. In another widely published statement available to see in a book called The World Must Know, published by United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, she said, I remember one set of twins in particular, Guido and Ina, aged about 4. One day, Mengele took them away. When they returned, they were in a terrible state. They had been sewn together back to back like Siamese twins. Their wounds were infected and oozing pus. They screamed day and night. Then their parents, I remember the mother's name was Stella, managed to get some morphine and they killed the children in order to end their suffering. On January 26, 1945, just before the camp was liberated, survivor Vera Kriegel said the guards were in a big panic, so they poured petrol over the barracks and tried to destroy all the evidence. Not long after, the Soviets arrived. One of the first things the liberators did was to ask the kids at the camp to show the numbers tattooed on their arms. A Red Army soldier named Grigory Elisavetsky later said to the adults, they rushed toward us shouting, fell on their knees, kissed the flaps of our overcoats, and threw their arms around our legs. The soldiers then looked around in utter disbelief. They eventually found eyeglasses weighing a staggering 88 pounds. They discovered around 44,000 pairs of shoes and warehouses stacked to the roof of people's belongings. The Germans had killed most of the Jews who'd been forced to work in the gas chambers. They'd set fire to most of the documents concerning the horrors that happened there. And as they left, they took thousands of prisoners on what turned out to be death marches for many to other camps. One of the 9,000 that remained at the camp was the girl we'd already talked about, Eva Moses Kor, someone who would never forget those medical experiments. But where was Dr. Mengele? Was he going to suffer the same fate as Rudolf Hess, the officer who was Auschwitz commandant? In 1947, this guy was hanged close to the Gestapo office at Auschwitz. Indeed, Mengele would certainly have suffered a similar fate had he not been a fairly accomplished escape artist. Now we come to part 2 of the show. Prior to leaving the camp, he gathered up as many materials as he could concerning his medical experiments. He took with him all the specimens he thought were precious to medical science, and then ended up at the Gross Rosen concentration camp. About 20 days after the Red Army arrived at his former camp, he then headed to Czechoslovakia. His fake document said he was an officer in the army, not a medical doctor to the Nazis. Around this time, he handed many of the most important medical papers to a nurse that he'd been in a relationship with. But it was now just a matter of time until he was caught, and that happened when he was picked up by the Americans in June. Now, a few months after the liberation of the camp, they had him, finally. But due to some miscommunication or lack of information, or both, the Americans didn't know that the man they had on their hands was one of the worst Nazi war criminals of them all. He also didn't have an SS blood group tattoo, which would have let the Americans know what kind of man they had on their hands. So in July, they just let him go. They couldn't possibly hold every German soldier they found. Soon, Mengele got hold of the documents that stated his name was Fritz Ullmann, which he later changed to Fritz Holman. The chase was on, and by God, it would be a long one. He got a job in Bavaria as a farmhand under that name, only returning once to what were now dangerous areas for him to recover those camp documents that he treasured so much. He was well aware that if they got hold of him again, he'd end up hanging by the neck as a war criminal. On April 17, 1949, he finally got out of Germany and landed in Italy. This was no easy task, but with the aid of SS officers and escape routes called rat lines, he made it. There, he used the International Committee of the Red Cross to obtain a passport with the name Helmut Greger. In July that year, he sailed across the ocean to Argentina, his wife not at his side. They later divorced. In Buenos Aires, he soon found work as a carpenter, and later, with the help of Nazi sympathizers, he moved into a better area. Things were looking up, especially when he started making money selling farming supplies for that company his father had founded, Carl Mengele and Sons. He even traveled to nearby countries as a sales rep, and with cash in hand, he got himself a pretty good apartment in downtown Buenos Aires. At this point, he wasn't the only Nazi war criminal hiding out in the country. It took many years for the Argentine government to do anything about these people, even after the Nazi hunters had identified them or the German government had asked for their extradition. Mengele wasn't exactly the proverbial needle in a haystack. In the 1950s, he got his real birth certificate from the West German embassy, and then he acquired a passport. Believe it or not, he actually used that passport to make trips back to Europe. He even had the audacity to meet his son Rolf at a ski resort in Switzerland in 1956. You'll know soon how Rolf felt about his father. In 1958, he bought himself a house in Buenos Aires, moving in with his new wife, Martha, and her son. The money was now coming in, not only from the farming business but also from a pharmaceutical company that he opened called Fadro Farm. Then he and other Nazi doctors were rounded up by the Argentine authorities and accused of practicing medicine without a license. Mengele knew this might bring attention to his past activities, so he planned to move. We don't need to tell you that there were no computers back then, so it wasn't as if his name flashed in red lights on screens as a Nazi war criminal. His name popped up again and again during the Nuremberg trials, but it was assumed he had died. But then more information was discovered by Nazi hunters, and in time, with more interviews of survivors, they knew that Josef Mengele had been one huge rotten egg in the stinking omelet that was Nazism. In 1959, the West German authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. Surely, now the Angel of Death was about to get stuck in his own web. But by the time the Argentinians had granted the extradition, Mengele had moved again, this time to a small farmhouse over the border in Paraguay. Still, just prior to this point, he was inches away from being caught. In 1960, Mossad agents from Israel swooped into Argentina and basically kidnapped the high-ranking Nazi Adolf Eichmann. This was some catch, given that Eichmann was one of those main orchestrators behind the Holocaust. He was hanged 2 years after his trial, and was this man who, as a kid, enjoyed playing the violin and running around the woods with his scout group, who inspired that term, the banality of evil. To get him, Mossad agents had to make a huge sacrifice. That was not capturing Mengele, who they'd also had an address for. They knew that if they got Mengele, this would alert Eichmann, and despite the doctor being one of the very worst in the grand scheme of things, Eichmann was just a bigger fish that polluted the pond of Nazism. One of the agents later explained, "When I have a bird in my hand, I don't start looking for the bird in the bush. I'll take the bird in my hand, put it in a cage, and then deal with the one in the bush." But as you know, that bird in the bush spread its wings and fled. Now this time, photos and a list of atrocities were in the newspapers, and there was a reward on its head. But with the help of Nazi sympathizers, he managed to get to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he met 2 Hungarian expatriates who allowed him to stay on their farm, with the condition that he managed it for them. At the time, they didn't know who Mengele really was, and even invested with him in a coffee and cattle farm in Brazil's Serra Negra. Those Mossad agents were again hot on his tail, and now that Hungarian couple knew who they'd done business with. They also understood the risks involved with harboring a fugitive as wanted as Mengele. At that same time, the German government issued yet another extradition order, and this time in Brazil. Mengele was now in a constant state of stress, never knowing who would turn up one day and send him back to be executed. He chewed his mustache at the sides, bit his fingernails, froze whenever he saw a car approaching his farm, and he got sick, notably after all that hair he'd chewed off had blocked up his intestines. Times were tough, but this man never changed his ways in terms of how he felt about a superior race. He wrote a lot in his diaries, once condemning another Nazi leader who, after being caught, had shown remorse. He diminishes himself, showing repentance. That's lamentable. One time he wrote about being broke, saying, "What's going to happen? Now I feel lonely, or rather abandoned, more painfully than ever." In another entry he wrote, "Right now I'm having dreams of a double-edged guillotine." Not once in the diaries did he show any remorse. In fact, once he wrote, "I gave life in Auschwitz, I did not take it." Then he wrote that Jewish people should not be able to mix their blood with others, and his true colors were seen. He explained more, saying, "It's to be expected that the process of interbreeding, at least in Europe, lends itself to the neighboring races. In other continents, there are occurring important and convincing experiences. I can affirm that the results have been very agreeable. Apartheid is a very efficient way to discontinue interbreeding." His prediction was that 90% of humans would die because of this mixing of races, what he called human stupidity. Those diaries, by the way, were later sold to a Jewish-American grandson of a Holocaust survivor for $245,000. The collection held something like 4,000 pages in total describing the twisted thoughts of the monster. In the early 1970s, his depression got the worst of him after the Hungarian couple decided to split from the Nazi. They left and Mengele wasn't invited, but they did at least rent him a slum house in Diadema in Sao Paulo. It was there in 1977 that he met his son Rolf, who he'd not seen since that ski resort trip in Switzerland many years ago. Rolf later told the American media that he still can never find it in himself to give his father up, and after all, that would be killing him. Still, he said he was shocked when he saw his pop was totally unrepentant. He was still a full-fledged Nazi. The world had moved on, but his father was still clinging to and embracing the most shameful period in German history. Rolf was later asked if he believed his dad had done all those horrific things, to which he replied, "I have to agree that the witnesses are telling the truth. And you can imagine that it's not very easy to believe it, but there is so much evidence and I really have to believe it." He thinks he is not responsible for it because he did not invent the concentration camp. He thought he was on duty. It's an order. Rolf said he tried talking about the subject with his father in 1977, and when he told him what he did was brutal, absolutely inhumane, his father just said, "I did what I was told to do." Rolf said he pitied his father, and when he saw him for the last time, he saw a broken man. He was living in a hut in a slum. He had dangerously high blood pressure. He just had a stroke. Then on February 7, 1979, while Joseph Mengele was at a coastal resort in Brazil's Bertioga, he had another stroke while swimming in a pool. The cause of death was drowning, but some people later questioned whether he really had died and had not just run off again. But this was true, as DNA evidence showed many years later, and just as Rolf had said, the big bad wolf of medicine was dead, and no one mourned the loss outside of his close family. We'll finish with the words of a survivor, words we should never forget. Pearl Pufiles once said in reference to her ignorance when she was a kid in the camp, "He was kind to us, and how could you hate him when he was so handsome?" That's just it. In the sphere of the banality of evil, this monster of a man was also human, all too human. Evil people don't have horns, they usually have ambition and like pleasing their bosses. Tyranny doesn't present itself as tyranny, it never has, and it won't again in the future. Keep your eyes wide open and don't let your heart fool you. Now you need to watch something very interesting in why Hitler's nephew was his worst enemy, or change the subject with something amusing in Gorilla vs. Bear. Who would win? Animal comparison.